Now that you've read some samples, let's take a detailed look at the rubric. Row 1 is about understanding and analysing context. This row looks at whether the research is clearly focused through an approach, range of perspectives or lens, and whether it is selected well enough to allow for substantial, complex contextualising of the team problem or issue. There are several key indicators to look for in this row. Firstly, we need to know what the research report is specifically about. So, is the team research problem or issue clearly stated? Is the approach, the perspectives or lens clear? Or is it left for the reader to infer? Is the focus or scope of the research sufficiently but not overly narrow? You'll often find the evidence for this in titles and first paragraphs. For example, the title of the Rhino Horns paper, Sample 1, clearly signals the topic and the lens: global legalization, political considerations. The introduction to the report also signals the complexity of the issue, and the body of the report further engages this complexity. This is important to reach the highest level in the rubric. Compare that to the topic for Sample 5, cyberbullying. This topic is overly broad and the exact focus of the report is unclear, as it asks the question at the top, does cyberbullying affect teens today? But the report goes on to list tips for children, parents and schools on how to avoid it. Now contrast that to Sample 3, the environmental impacts of war, which is certainly more focused as a topic than cyberbullying, but the report tries to deal with many variables in this topic, like types of pollution, displacement and resettlement, physical damage, impacts on animals and wildlife, so it could have benefited from further narrowing to allow more focused research and reporting. A second important consideration for this row is, does the bibliography or work cited show evidence of careful source selection? This row is focused on the proficiency, understand and analyse context, so the sources students choose to include should help them address the real complexity of the problem or issue they are researching, so simplistic or journalistic sources are unlikely to be the most useful. Remember too, the task asks for a well-researched report. If the research has been very superficial, then it will not score highly in this row. In the rubric, the descriptors say, wide variety of appropriate sources, some variety, or little evidence of research. In the context of AP seminar, the term appropriate sources would usually mean academic sources. Unless the topic dictates otherwise, academic sources should be used for a high score in this row. Remember, as part of the AP seminar course, they have learned how to evaluate the relevance and credibility of sources of information and data, and that needs to be demonstrated in what they select to go in their reports. The next slide shows an example. The Rhino Horns paper, Sample 1, balances academic journals like the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, the Annals of Association of American Geographers, with primary sources, the CITES Treaty and NGO websites. Two more journalistic sources, Science Magazine and The Economist, provide additional general context, but the report does not over-rely on these sources. Compare the Rhino bibliography and its use to that provided for the report, The Psychological Effects of Terrorism in Sample 2. The terrorism report lists a variety of sources including the Journal of International Criminal Justice. Tellingly, this academic source is never referenced in the body of the report. Instead, the report many times draws from journalistic sources like the International Business Times, or from specialized reference sources like the APA website articles or journalist resource. While these journalistic sources and specialized reference sources are valuable for preliminary research, they are not generally the most appropriate ending points for academic research. If a student chooses to use these specialized reference sources instead of primary sources, the case for credibility needs to be explicitly made. Now look at the citations page for the sample cyberbullying, Sample 5. This report references 3 sources all derived from the same article. As only one source was used, this would fall into the little evidence of research category and score 2 or low for this row. The third and final consideration for this row is the connection. Does the report make the significance of what they're researching clear? This is the so what factor, or why does it matter? So ask, does the report connect to the wider problem or issue? So, to recap for row 1, there are 3 primary things to look for: clarity and focus, careful source selection, and the connection to the overall problem or issue. Typically, low responses will be overly broad and general, simplistic, and contain very few and/or very poor quality sources. Medium responses will be adequately focused, have some variety of sources, and make some reference to the overall problem. High responses are normally clear and focused, which allows them to deal with the complexities of an issue and draw mainly upon academic or primary sources.